All right. Can we begin now? Okay. Please, thank you very much, everyone, for waiting. And we'll just kick off the event so that to the time as much as possible. Um, it's it's good to meet everyone today, and I hope you will get the best out of this event. So today we are looking at MVC to repository design pattern in Laravel. Uh, so let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Lekia, and I'm a software engineer with more than half a decade of experience building enterprise application. And I've worked in several organizations across US and Canada, and also in Africa. So a couple of times it's good to understand. I felt it's good to understand design, and that's why this topic is crucial for solving critical issues on our code base. Please, any question, let's do well to leave our questions. Also, comment in the chat. I'll try as much as possible to attend to them on the talk. If you do have a question, please, you can leave it on the chat. Okay, so for this event, the record will be made available after the end of the event. So you can get back on the event page and you have access to the record. Thank you very much. Please let's do as well keep to the community guidelines and the rules so that everyone will feel comfortable. So for this event, I'll try as much as possible to keep it general because I know people have varying understanding and we are coming from different backgrounds. So, so for those of us who are quite young in the industry and those of us who may not have much experience, I want everyone to be carried along. Yeah, and for those of us who have many years of experience, we are still going to get something at the end of the day. So it's a kind of open event. So we want to make sure that everyone gets something at the end of the day. Thank you very much. Okay, so so this is me with a laptop, certainly. All right, so as breaker, I have a quote that says you own any code as you break, but you can only give out what you have fixed. So the thing is, sometimes people are scared to try out different things. They are not used to, let's say, working with that particular procedure. So because of that, they have reservation. Solution architect, trying things out is a good way of getting to know some innovation in the industry and also getting to solve problems outside the box. And the outline for this talk today will be, in the first place, look at overview of the repository design pattern. In the second section, we'll look at the benefits of repository design pattern and the summary and other resources to get more insight into design pattern in general. Let me know at any point if you can't hear me. If there's at any point you can't get to hear me properly or the audio is not clear, just signify and let me know so that I can get back on track. And I hope everyone can hear me at this point. All right. So, okay. Oh, thank you very much, Ahmed. All right. So, the overview of the repository design pattern. So, first things first, there are some technical terms we'll be using for this talk. And the first one is model view controller. So, the model view controller is the default pattern that the Laravel framework comes with. I don't know, it's a popular framework for PHP. So when you install the framework for the first time, without making any changes, the normal, or let's say the default setting is the model, which is the layer that speak to the database and the tables, your tables. And then we have the view, the presentation, and then we have the controller where you are getting your request, you are validating the request, and you are formatting the request, so the response, sorry. Um, the repository simply means a collection of things. So we can have collection of logic, and that collection of logic, we can put it together and make it our repository. Interface. So from the definition, from PHP documentation, interface allows us to create code which specify which methods a class must implement. So without having to define how these methods are implemented. So an interface is more like a contract where any class that implements that contract must abide to the rules of that contract, to the rules of that interface. So if class A implements interface B, then all the methods in that interface must be implemented by the class. But the interface itself does not define the implementation. It does not carry out the implementation. The class do the implementation while the interface defines the rule. That's in a summary. We're going to look at Solid. So Solid is a popular object-oriented design principle, which stands for single responsibility, open and close, list cuff substitution, interface segregation, and dependency injection. I know this is something that we have seen already as technical people, and I know that we are familiar with it to a good extent. So, moving forward. Okay. Uh, so, the highlights of the repository design pattern. So, first of all, let me say that the repository design pattern is tested, is a design that someone or technical people have put together to solve certain problems. It does not answer the questions of all the questions we have. It does not solve all the problems, but certain issues and certain problems can be addressed using the repository design pattern. So this pattern is an abstraction of the data layer. So your abstraction means that you are enclosing some implementation. You are enclosing it. You are abstracting it away so that it has some level of control, privacy, and guidelines. The repository design pattern is not tied to PHP. It's not tied to Laravel. It's language agnostic. This means that you can use it in Java. You can implement it in C Sharp. You can implement it in any other object-oriented programming language. And the heart of the repository design pattern is the interface. The interface is the game changer. For the model view controller, which is the MVC pattern, the major player are the classes. For the controllers are just classes that have been supercharged. So they extend the base controller. But for an interface, for a repository design pattern, you have an interface where the class implements the interface. So the interface is at the heart of the repository design pattern. It is the center of it. The major components of the design part of this design pattern are the service, the controller, and the repository. The repository is the interface, while we have services that houses or that takes the business logic, and then the controller takes care of presentation of data and formatting of our response. So the controller is in charge of validation. Once you get your request, you get your requests, and those requests are validated. You pass them to the interface, to the implementation, and you get your response back. You can format that response as much as you want. All right. So why do we want to talk about repository design pattern? Why should anybody care about it? Why should you use it in your projects? So I want to mention that the repository design pattern does not solve every technical problem. And if you look around the internet and you look around different articles and stuff like that, you can see some slight difference in how people implement things. So there's nothing wrong with choosing with tweaking your own implementation. You can adjust your implementation to suit your business need, because at the end of the day, the design is made for man. Man is not made for the design. So whatever pattern you decide to adopt in your business or in your company, you can decide to make modification to make it suit your business need and get output. So let's remember at the end of the day, what you want to do is solve problem. You don't want to just adopt a pattern why it is not giving you the desired output. Okay, that being said, let's look at some of the benefits. The design pattern makes it possible to write code that are maintainable, reusable, extendable, and clean. When you follow a pattern for a team, let's say you have a team of 50 engineers, or let's say you have a team of 30 engineers, that's quite a medium-sized team. If you allow everybody to just do whatever they want, the code base is going to be messed up. But if you have a design, you have a pattern the team should follow, then it is easy to maintain. It is easy to apportion tasks. People can work on one particular service while another set of engineers work on a different service. It makes the code reusable, so you can switch implementation. Let's say, for instance, you want to implement Amazon Pay, and you have Amazon Pay already implemented, and you decide to maybe switch to something different, maybe Stripe. You can actually switch the implementation without breaking the entire code base or rewriting everything from scratch. So it is reusable, it is extendable. One of the principle of Solid says that a class should be open for extension and close to modification. The class should not be modified, but it should be extendable. So the repository design pattern makes that particular principle possible, where the class inheritance and interface helps in extending the functionality of a class without modifying that class. And then lastly, it makes the code clean. You have a code base that you are proud of, and it is easy to test. So the next thing is it is easy to test. You can actually mock that implementation, that particular implementation. You can mock it, and therefore it is easy to test. The pattern also decouples the code. So one of those setbacks of the MVC pattern is that the controller is tightly coupled to the model, because we have just the controller as the class that communicates directly to the database, and it's not meant to be so. The controller is not meant to see, or to have to see what the database looks like, or what the implementation of the business logic is. What the controller is meant to do is to get requests, format response, and validate. Now, when you implement the repository design pattern, you abstract the business logic into a service that is enclosed. So you have that level of control and privacy. The repository design pattern follows the solid principle. I may not go in depth into this one, but when we look at the implementation, we'll understand some bits better. Okay, do we have any question at this point? I would love to see if we have any question at this point. Okay, separation of concern. Yes, that makes sense. Yes, thank you very much, Luanza. That makes sense. All right, so we are going to look at the implementation of the design pattern. Okay, like I mentioned, the heart of that pattern is the interface. So it begins with defining what the classes should implement, the rules. So the interface does not do the implementation. You can look at this one. This is a typical Laravel code base. You have this, or let's say PHP. You have this interface, payment repository. And we have two methods, create charge, retrieve charge. So if you go to this Stripe API, you can see a method, a kind of implementation for create charge, where they create the charge and you can retrieve charge. So let's say you want to charge a card, any card. It can be a MasterCard, and you want to charge that particular card. So this method should be in charge of charging that card. And then you can also retrieve cards. So we have our interface defined. And once we have our interface defined, the next thing is the implementation. So I don't know if this is visible. I'll still have to share so that we can. So here we have a service called Stripe Charge. So this service is implemented by the engineers to charge a card. This is a simple implementation. I've intentionally left the code to be this small so that we don't battle with cognitive reasoning, just to ease our thought process. So this is a lean implementation. We have the class constructor where we are starting the service, where we are initializing our Stripe client, and we have the charge method that charges the card. So what do we need? We need the amount to be charged. We need the currency. We need the source. The source stands for the card, Master or Visa. Then we need the description, which is optional. So this is the class implementing this interface. The next thing is, okay, so after we implement our methods, we have to register it with the provider, with the container, the Laravel container. How does this work? The Laravel container is an IOC container that gets that binds the class. It can actually bind anything. You can actually bind anything to the container. But in this case, we are trying to let the Laravel container know that whenever I call the payment repository, because you cannot initialize an interface. So whenever I call this interface, resolve it to the payment service. Give me the payment service. So the best place to register it is in the service provider. And in this case, I have made a separate service provider. We have the default service provider that comes with the Laravel framework, but this one have made a separate service provider just to make things look nice and easy to manage. So this service provider, we register our payment repository. So we bind the interface to the service. Now, finally, after binding the interface to the service, you have to register this particular provider in your config. So when you go to your config, the app, you register your provider. So below here, on line 6, I have registered service provider to the app config. All right. So on our controller, this is where we see where magic is happening. So this is a payment controller. In the payment controller, it's sorry. This is a bit so in the payment controller, the create charge minus, which is the app description and the currency. I validate this. I pass to the payment. The payment repository is that is injected. So it injected as into the constructor. Now I pass all my my data into the create charge, because the create charge is expecting an array, right? It's expecting an array. I pass in that array. I do all the implementation on the service. If you go back to the former slide, so this is where I'm doing all my implementation. I can do my calculation here, whatever I want to do. I run my service here, and so the response is returned as an. So if you look at this, it is returning an array which is gotten on the response here. So the response here can be passed, is returned as a JSON. So I'm not doing error handling, doing exception handling. So this is just a lean code just to demonstrate the repository design pattern. Now I get my response, pass the response to the formatter, format it, get out to whoever is that response. Another thing is with two controllers. In two controllers, we can have one controlling it for for JSON, which is suitable for our API, and we can have another controller that is formatting it for our view. So instead of returning the response as JSON, you can return it as view in another controller. So the controller we also inject the repository into the controller, and that controller gets the response and return it into the blade. So if you are using blade data, into doing that, if you're not doing anything web and you just want to do API, you can use this other method on the screen here. You return it as a JSON response back the API endpoint. So we can have two controllers at the same time. So there are code base that have the web version and the API version. So they have a dashboard where they are rendering all the data, and they also have the API version where the people where it's being consumed on maybe a front end framework like maybe React or Angular. So they have two controllers. The controllers get the data from the payment repository and it's rendered on the web version, or we have another controller that also renders it as a JSON response. All right, so I will also want to pause and if we have any questions. Do we have any question? Okay. So
yeah, how you doing? I got a question.
I don't see the two controllers, Gospel.
there's an echo.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Lawanza, but it's echoing.
Yeah, there's no echo, is it? Because I'm getting echo on my side. Okay, I'm back. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it sounds better.
Yeah, I'm sorry for the confusion. I have for you is, have you ever considered having a control flow diagram, to help us follow, the logic that you're presenting here in your model view controller program?
Okay. So you are requesting for, if I get you right, a control flow diagram, right? That can help you understand it.
Yeah, I have an MVC3 certificate, and it's been a while since I've used MVC, and I did some work in 5 a long time ago, but a flow control diagram, let's say one put together in Visio, can serve as an aid to viewers so they can get a better insight and handle on the flow of the logic that you're presenting with the source code.
Okay. What I want to do is I'll present the source code and I'll explain things from the source code. At the moment, I don't have, there's no control flow diagram, but I can provide that at the end of this event and give some
Sure.
explanation to it on the comments. That will actually supplement for the content that have been delivered on the event, on the talk.
Sure. Thank
Okay.
you.
So the next section of what I'll be sharing with us is the live code, which I want us to take a look at to demonstrate what we have put together so far. Okay. All right. So what you'll be looking at is my editor. All right. This looks good. So I have my editor here, and I want to start from the payment controller. I'll take it one step at a time. When you install a new Laravel framework, what you get are models. So you get the models, your models here, and you have your controllers, which is here, right? And then you have your views, where you have all the rendering. If you want to actually maybe do something like, let's say, you want to do it on Blade, you can render it on Blade. So if you want to pass it to some like a React framework, or let's say a Vue framework, you can pass your data to the framework, and then get it into something that users can relate with. So that MVC that's the MVC pattern that comes default on default with Laravel. So once you install a new Laravel project, you have that default uh, pattern. So all your views are loaded here. If you want to use Blade, you can use Blade. You can do Vue.js. You can do that. Okay, but on the repository design pattern, we are looking in another folder called repositories. So repositories are more like your, let's say, the interface. They are the interface that your class, your service should implement. Now, I have two services here. I have let's look at this. I have Amazon Pay and I have Stripe Charge. Amazon Pay is a service I want my business to consider. Maybe my business needs Amazon Pay, and I have set of engineers working on this particular service. I can actually allocate the other set of engineers to work on Stripe API. So while they integrate Stripe API, these other engineers can implement Amazon Pay. But we have defined a payment interface for everybody to follow. We want to charge our customers, and we want to retrieve the charges. This is the interface. So if you are implementing Amazon Pay, two methods must be implemented. Charge the customer card, give me a medium for retrieving the customer charge, right? This is Stripe. For Stripe, if you want to use Stripe to also charge the customer, here it is, the implementation. This other set of engineers can charge the customer and also give us the ability to retrieve a charge. So this is why separation of concern and also making the code maintainable, reusable, and easy to follow and implement. This is why it is good to keep this practice. And that's why this design pattern is important. In this Amazon Pay, I have actually create a wrapper. This is more like a wrapper for our Amazon API or SDK. So here is the actual SDK, which is in my window. And you can see the entire implementation of the Amazon SDK. But this is not what we want to deal with at the moment. Okay, so going forward on our controller, we have a payment controller. What does this payment controller do? It has create charge method. It gets the request, validates the request. If the validation fails, give us the error. All right. After that, pass the request to the payment repository, which is injected into the constructor. Now, when this request is passed to the payment repository. The payment repository service takes care of all of the implementation, which is, I'll go to this one now. So it takes care of all the implementation here, which is what we can see here. It does the charging and sends the response back. The response is sent back to the controller, the payment controller. Now, the payment controller is in charge of presenting that response back to our caller. So the payment controller, the controller formats the response. So this may actually not be JSON. This can be, we are returning, let's say, a view, let's say welcome, and we pass the response into, the view. So the controller should be in charge of first validating the request, which is what we are doing here, validate the request, send the request into the repository where the request is processed and the response is returned back, the response and return it back to the caller or the user. In this case, you can send it as, or you can send it as lead or view to any user, or let's say as a web version for any user. So we actually have two controllers. I can controller here. I can create a new controller here. Say, I have this controller. Sorry, let me duplicate this one. Okay, so I can rename this controller, let's say, for my view, for my web payment. I can call it web. And instead of returning JSON, I can return a view. So the first controller can return the JSON, which is what I'm doing now in this place. And this other controller can return the web view. So when you have your route, of course, you can define the route that hits the web version of the controller, and you can define the route that hits the JSON version of the controller. So you just go to your web and define your route, or you can create a new web file, a new route file entirely. You can create a new route file that hits the web endpoint, and you create another route file that hits the API endpoint. So this one will hit a payment controller payment controller. It will hit the payment controller, the charge method. It will hit this payment controller there for the API. Why this second one? We hit the web version. Charge. So it will return response based on what you have done. Why this will also return response based on the API response you want. So this is for the JSON. This is for the JSON, which is for okay, this is for the web actually, sorry. Why this is for our API. All right, so when you are done with that, we have our providers. You have to register your, because what is happening here is that you are calling an interface and you cannot instantiate an interface. You can actually instantiate a class, but you can't do that for an interface. So you want to register this with the Laravel container so that whenever this interface is called, it gives you the class implementation. So you do that in the providers. You come to the payment service provider, you create a new service provider, or you can use an existing service provider. You can come to your app service provider and do it here, but I prefer creating a new service provider. So in this case, I've created a new service provider and I've registered my payment repository to the payment service class. So whenever this is called, this payment service class will be implemented. So where I'm using payment repository, it will be bind it or resolve to payment service class. So at the day, after you're done with the providers, you want to register the provider, which is the normal or the default way to do it in Laravel. You come to your app config. In the app config, this is where you register all providers to the Laravel container. So here, I've registered the payment service provider and you are good to go. So that's the walkthrough for this implementation. All right, I want to take questions right now.
Yeah, this is Lawans or
Okay.
Quince. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, I think I heard you mention something about injecting inversion of control, at some point in your presentation. Um, is this an example of the application of the solid principles that you mentioned earlier on um, in your overview?
Okay, yes. I mentioned application of solid principles. The actual thing is the solid principle. The repository design pattern already follows the solid principle. If you remember, if you can recall some of the principles in solid, it says that single responsibility. You want a class to do just one thing. For instance, I have a class here, and that class is my payment. Let me quickly go to my Stripe charge. So this class is just doing one thing. It is charging a card and returning the charge to us. So it is concerned with charging a card. So that's like saying a single responsibility, right? And we have the open and close. Oh, so the class should be closed to modification, but open to extension. That means that we shouldn't uh, modify the class directly. Instead, we should have a way to create inheritance, or we should have a way to modify, or let's say make changes to the actions in the class. So the methods in this class, I shouldn't tamper with it, but I can create an inheritance. Maybe I can create a new class, a child class that alters or make changes to this implementation. So that's That's that. Then we have the other one where we inject into the the uh, the constructor, which is more like say the inversion of control. So Laravel is actually resolving that every class in its container using the IOC. And that's a principle that is good in programming. So if you look at it very well, most of the solid principle have already been built embedded into the framework, and it has also been embedded into the design uh, pattern we are looking at today.
I see. Also, I noted that with the MVC pattern, you were talking about JSON and routes and that sort of thing, and endpoints. So it appears as if this MVC pattern can also accommodate RESTful services as well. Could you expound on that there, Gospel?
Okay, if I get it very well, you are asking if the MVC pattern can be used for RESTful API.
Yeah, RESTful, API services. Obviously, it looks like that because, like with RESTful
Okay,
services, you have endpoints and you furry back and forth data using JavaScript object notation. Is that correct?
yes. So for MVC, the problem with MVC is that MVC, if I don't have my service, okay, so let's look at this. If I don't have this service here, I'm going to do all of this implementation in my controller or in my model. So all of the implementation will be stored in my model, and that makes the model big. It makes the class to become bulky because after I validate, I'll have to start doing the entire implementation. So let me remove this. I'll do the entire implementation here and also render the output. So that becomes a problem with MVC. Your implementation and your business logic is all dumped into the controller. The controller gets bulky and gets big, and the controller is doing too many things. So, for instance, this create charge is validating. It validates this data. It will now handle the implementation and renders the data. That's too much for just one class to do and just one method to do. So, but the repository design pattern solves the problem by abstracting the implementation layer. It abstracts the implementation or the business logic into a service. And within that service, you can do all your implementation. Okay, let's say if I was using Amazon Pay before, I can remove Amazon Pay and replace it with Stripe without breaking or rewriting the code base. I'll have to just do a little work to just replace any service I want to replace. And that solves a very good big problem.
Okay, so you take advantage to the configuration file of
Ye-
registering these individual services. I think you showed us that.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I think that's good for the day. I really enjoy taking this talk, and I want to get to the last part of it. So I still have one or two slides to just display. Any other question? Okay.
You're saying those services abstract the implementation. Is that what you're saying? The implementation of the interface?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so we to wrap it up, purpose. Okay, so the core purpose of the repository design pattern is to and writing code a lot easier. Although we may have to do a lot of structuring and writing, but at the end, in the long run, it helps us. It helps to save time and helps for the team that is working on it. The repository design pattern is language agnostic. It is advisable for a medium to large scale project. So if you are doing a small project, this pattern may not be so useful because you may just have a little you are dealing with. But when the project is large, you see the beauty of the repository design pattern. It is advisable for large to medium scale projects. Okay, there's no hard and fast rule. You can tweak things to suit your situation. So one of the takeaway is I want us to implement this pattern in our Laravel project, and we can share our GitHub link to on the event page, comment section. Okay, so if you want to know more about the Laravel container, here's the link. In the Heart of Software by Eric Evans. It says domain-driven design. It dedicates a page, a section to talk about the repository design pattern. There are several other patterns. We have the strategy pattern, we have the bridge pattern, and there's also the singleton. Yes. So these other ones, if you read, you can look at them and you understand it as well. One of the
Laravel, pardon me, sir. Laravel Mullen use PHP or other language?
Oh yeah, you can use in any language. It's language. Any language. So if you want to see a practical implementation, one practical implementation of the repository design pattern is in Spring Boot project, Spring Boot framework. I've left a link here for us to look at and see how we can also understand it in a different programming language. So like I said, it is language agnostic, and whether you're coming from PHP or Java, you can actually get to relate with this design pattern. I'm going to share this slide with us after the talk. You can find it. You will find it in the event page.
Yeah,
I think that's all for
something to ask.
yes. So
Yeah, to ask you.
okay. So we can okay.
Yeah, I want to ask you their gospel. Isn't MVC integrated into the .NET Core framework? You have a homologous series of, .NET going back to some time ago, and doesn't the core, like, is it one or two, implement this MVC? And do you use Razor Pages? Oh, well, Razor Pages is with C# because you're working with PHP, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Do you ever
So
use C# and I think .NET Core maybe use Razor Pages? What were you going to say?
yes. So to fairly answer your question, I'm not very familiar with .NET, but I know that most of the modern framework implements the MVC pattern.
Well, what IDE are you using? I mean, from my experience, I use Visual Studio IDE that has .NET Core framework. What IDE are you using to to do MVC?
Okay, I use Visual Studio Code.
Okay, use Visual. You don't use the .NET framework. Which one are you using?
Okay, I do Java Spring Boot and as well as Laravel PHP.
So I'm surprised. So you're using Spring. So you don't use like is it Eclipse or something like that?
Okay.
I think they have an IDE or something like that,
Yes,
right?
yes. There's an I use IntelliJ and I've used Eclipse in the past, but I don't currently actively use Eclipse. But IntelliJ, yes, I use IntelliJ. Yes, and VS Studio, Visual Studio Code.
You can use Visual Studio with Java Spring. I didn't know that you could do that.
No, I think there's another one we call Visual Studio Code, which is the VS Code. That one
Oh
is
yes,
smaller
yes.
version and is more is lightweight and fast and has a very good community support. Yeah.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it supports JavaScript and that sort of thing.
Mm.
Now that one is real lightweight. Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah. Interesting.
Okay.
Okay, then thanks.
Thank you very much, everyone. Please, let's leave further questions in the chats on the event page. There's a comment section where we can keep the conversation going. I'll do well as much to answer any question on that page. And I hope that we keep in touch. You can find my connections on the slide here. Thank you, everyone, for joining in. Really, really appreciate the time and the effort. Yes, thank you. We hope to meet again. Thank you, everyone.